Trauma is not currency. In today's culture, where vulnerability is often equated with authenticity, there's a growing tendency to lead with pain, to present trauma as a form of identity, as if the depth of one's suffering somehow legitimizes one's place in a conversation or community. It learns who is emotionally safe not by hearing promises or declarations, but by witnessing behavior, tone, timing, and presence over time. When you bypass this process and open yourself too quickly, you place your inner world in the hands of someone whose intentions, emotional regulation, or capacity for empathy you haven't yet fully understood. This act of premature exposure might feel liberating in the moment. It can create a temporary illusion of closeness, but it often leads to imbalance, disappointment, or emotional withdrawal. The nervous system interprets deep sharing as a signal of vulnerability, and when that vulnerability is not met with reciprocity or care, it activates the threat response. The amygdala becomes more sensitive, trust circuits become impaired, and your baseline for emotional safety can shift. You start to build walls instead of bridges, not because you're closed off, but because your system has learned that openness leads to hurt. Trust is built through congruence. When what someone says matches what they do, consistently, especially under pressure, the brain picks up on these consistencies. It needs repetition to make accurate predictions, and prediction is central to emotional safety. If someone is warm one day and cold the next, available in one moment and absent in another, your nervous system detects that instability. It keeps you on high alert. You begin to brace instead of relax. You perform instead of express. Over time, this erodes not just your connection to others, but your connection to yourself. Intimacy without vetting also creates distorted bonding. When you share too soon, before emotional safety is earned, you project your needs onto the other person. You don't connect with them, you connect with the idea of who you hope they are. This is not real intimacy, it's fantasy. And fantasy, no matter how vivid, cannot hold the weight of genuine connection. The nervous system eventually senses the mismatch, and what once felt exciting turns into anxiety, confusion, or self-doubt. The vetting process isn't cynical, it's biological. It's how the brain protects its emotional energy, its focus, its identity. Opening up should be a choice made in alignment with someone's demonstrated ability to hold what you're offering. Not everyone has earned access to the more complex, fragile parts of you, and that's not arrogance or fear. It's discernment. Trust is earned not through words, but through experience. Psychological energy leaks are real. Your mind, like your body, has a finite amount of energy it can expend in a day, and not all mental activity is productive. Much of it gets drained through subtle, often unnoticed behaviors, especially those related to constant verbal processing, oversharing, and emotional overexposure. When you repeatedly speak about every thought, fear, or desire without intention or containment, you begin to leak energy that should be conserved for focused effort, emotional regulation, and personal growth. These leaks don't always look dramatic. They often masquerade as harmless conversations, venting sessions, or attempts to connect, but what they actually do is scatter your attention and diminish your cognitive clarity. Every time you articulate something, especially something personal, you are engaging mental resources that could be used elsewhere. The brain doesn't treat verbal expression lightly. It requires coordination across multiple regions: the prefrontal cortex for organization, the limbic system for emotional nuance, and the language centers to translate internal experience into speech. When this becomes habitual, when every internal fluctuation is externalized without pause, you train the mind to remain in a state of constant processing. Instead of resolution, you get rumination. Instead of clarity, you invite confusion. There's a hidden cost to being psychologically porous. When you give everyone access to your inner world, you lose track of what's actually worth sharing. Boundaries blur. Emotional noise increases. The brain thrives on selective focus. It needs to know what to prioritize, what to hold, and what to release. Constant exposure to your own, unfiltered emotional state makes that prioritization harder. You begin to feel emotionally exhausted without knowing why. You may interpret this exhaustion as anxiety, burnout, or low motivation, but in many cases, it's the byproduct of having too many open loops, too many mental tabs running in the background. because they've been opened without structure or purpose. Even more, when you rely on others to hold your psychological tension through constant disclosure, you erode your own capacity for containment, and containment isn't repression, it's a form of inner strength. It's the ability to hold conflicting emotions, unresolved questions, and emerging insights without the compulsion to unload them. This internal holding space is essential for deep work, creativity, and healing. When you always outsource that responsibility to others, you rob yourself of the opportunity to develop it. Psychological energy is also tied to identity. Every time you share something, you reinforce a narrative. That narrative becomes more familiar to the brain, more deeply wired. If you're constantly talking about overwhelm, failure, or confusion, you strengthen those networks. Over time, you start to live through them. On the other hand, when you conserve your energy, when you reflect before expressing, when you process privately before sharing, you give your brain the opportunity to integrate, to strengthen the circuits of resilience, focus, and intention. It's not about silence, it's about strategic self-respect. In a world that celebrates constant exposure and instant validation, the discipline to withhold, to protect, and to process internally is a rare strength. Your inner world is not a public forum. It is a sacred space where identity, focus, and resilience are. There's a strange urge in modern culture, a compulsion to share everything. We've been taught that transparency is always noble, that open books are more honest, that vulnerability equals strength. But the truth is more complex. Biology doesn't lie. And when it comes to the architecture of the brain, some things are meant to be kept within. There are 3 things you should never share indiscriminately, not because you're hiding, but because you're protecting something sacred, your trajectory, your scars, and your deepest desires. When you speak about your goals too early, before they've had a chance to root inside your nervous system, you risk triggering a dopamine reward that's unearned. It feels like accomplishment, but it's not. It's deception. Your brain gets the hit, but not the habit. You trade the fire of follow-through for the flicker of applause. Keep your goals inside until they're ready to walk with you. The real reward comes from doing the work, not describing it. Your pain, your trauma, your deep emotional wounds, they're part of your story, but they are not your introduction. Repeating them too often, too casually, begins to rewire your identity. Neuroplasticity doesn't care whether you repeat truth or fiction. It simply strengthens what you rehearse. Choose not to rehearse your pain as personality. Heal in safe spaces. Process with intent. Share only when it builds, not when it bleeds. And finally, your vision. That thing that wakes you up at night, the image that flashes across your mind when no one is watching, that's sacred. That's the fingerprint of your future self. Don't cast it out for cheap validation. The world doesn't need your dream diluted by external opinions before it's even born. Let it marinate in solitude. Let it sharpen in silence. Then, when it's ready, let it roar. You are not a vault, but you are not a faucet either. You are a conscious system, governed by neurochemistry, driven by emotion, anchored by purpose. Every thought you expose is a thread in the architecture of your identity. Choose wisely which ones you let the world pull on. Because what you protect, you grow, and what you give away too soon, you weaken. Train your mind like your body, with precision, with respect, and with restraint. Your future is counting on it. Neurological privacy is crucial. In a world where oversharing is often mistaken for connection, we forget the role that mental boundaries play in preserving our psychological health. Your brain is not just a container for thoughts and memories. It is an active living system constantly shaping your perception, behavior, and emotional state through chemical and electrical signals. When we expose our most sensitive thoughts too freely, we don't just risk judgment or misunderstanding, we alter the very neural architecture that governs how we feel, think, and act. At its core, the brain is designed to protect certain information, especially when it's tied to our core identity, long-term goals, or unprocessed emotions. When that information is repeatedly shared in environments that don't offer real safety, the brain interprets it as exposure without resolution. That creates cognitive dissonance and heightened stress. The limbic system, particularly the amygdala, becomes more reactive. Cortisol spikes. Instead of regulation, you get dysregulation. Instead of clarity, confusion. This is not about paranoia. It's about understanding that every mental disclosure has a neurobiological cost. And when the environment is not supportive or attuned, that cost can exceed the benefit. The prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and impulse control, is designed to filter what's worth expressing and what's worth holding. That's not repression, it's regulation. The brain isn't built to be constantly transparent. There is power in containment. And when you hold a thought internally, especially one tied to desire, pain, or self-definition, it becomes a subject for deeper processing, internal refinement, and integration. Sharing prematurely disrupts that cycle. It throws the thought into the external world before your brain has metabolized its meaning. Consider how this affects goal setting. Neuroscience shows us that articulating a goal to others too soon can activate a premature reward signal in the dopaminergic pathways. You feel as if you've done something meaningful just by speaking about it, but that's an illusion. Dopamine was designed as a motivator toward action, not as a substitute for achievement. And sharing before action confuses your motivational circuitry, creating a false sense of progress that often leads to diminished follow-through. The same principle applies when we share trauma or deeply personal struggles without the proper container. It might feel relieving in the moment, but long-term it risks locking you into a loop of re-identifying with pain rather than resolving it. A brain thrives in environments where it feels safe, structured, and internally coherent. Constantly dispersing your internal world across multiple unfiltered interactions fragments that structure. It weakens coherence. It erodes the psychological membrane that distinguishes self from others. That boundary is essential not only for mental health, but also for focus, clarity, and agency. Holding certain thoughts in private allows the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex to collaborate in forming integrated memory and meaning. You're not suppressing, you're cultivating. That's a very different process from avoidance. Neurological privacy is not about being closed off. It's about understanding that the mind, like the body, needs containment in order to grow strong. Your thoughts deserve to be processed in environments where they can be metabolized into strength, not scattered into noise. Early sharing of goals disrupts dopamine cycles. At first glance, sharing your ambitions might seem like a way to build accountability or generate motivation, but neuroscience tells a different story. When you verbalize your goals too early, especially in social contexts that offer validation or approval, your brain interprets that act as if progress is already being made. This leads to the premature release of dopamine, the neurotransmitter primarily responsible for motivation and reward-seeking behavior. That dopamine surge is supposed to occur in response to meaningful action, not just talk. But the brain doesn't always differentiate between real progress and the illusion of it as a result. The neural pathways that should be primed for sustained effort become falsely satisfied, and the drive to continue diminishes. This is a biological trap. The brain rewards you for the announcement, not the achievement. In evolutionary terms, dopamine was meant to help you chase the lion, hunt the food, build the shelter. It's about moving toward a goal, not imagining it. But when you talk about your goal and receive praise or recognition for it, the reward system activates as if the task were already in motion or even complete. That's why the next steps feel harder. The urgency dulls. The momentum fades. You begin to wonder why you can't follow through with the same intensity you felt when you first declared your intent. It's not weakness or laziness, it's neurochemistry. Moreover, early sharing can tether your goal to external validation instead of intrinsic motivation. When your ambition becomes a performance for others, your nervous system recalibrates. Your actions become shaped by feedback loops from your environment rather than from the internal compass that initially inspired the goal. This can lead to chronic misalignment. You may pursue the image of success rather than the substance of it. And when setbacks arise, which they always do, the resilience needed to push through is weakened because the source of your drive was external approval, not internal commitment. There's also the issue of cognitive depletion. Every time you speak about a goal, especially with enthusiasm, you engage cognitive and emotional resources that are finite. The energy expended in explanation, storytelling, and justification creates the sensation of progress, but none of it contributes to real advancement. Your brain mistakes narrative for experience, and when it comes time to do the actual work, those reserves have already been partially drained. Keeping goals private in the early stages allows the brain to engage fully with the challenge, to build a robust internal reward system that strengthens with each small win. That internal momentum is what creates sustainable effort. It's what makes grit possible. Your dopamine system should fire in response to actions, not applause, because it's the action that shapes your identity, not the statement. The work is what reinforces the neural circuits associated with achievement and competence. And when those circuits are strong, they become self-reinforcing, building the kind of motivation that doesn't rely on anyone else's opinion.